Somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, 4 kilometers beneath the waves, there is a piece of metal that 239 families have been waiting 11 years to find. Not a rumor. Not a theory. A real, physical object resting in total darkness, in water so deep that sunlight has never touched it, in a landscape no human being has ever seen with their own eyes. For over a decade, ships have crossed above it. Robots have crawled beneath it. Governments have spent more money searching for it than almost anything in the history of aviation. And still, as of this year, it has not been found. But something has changed. The hunt that the world quietly gave up on has been switched back on, armed with better machines, sharper data, and a location that investigators now believe is closer to the truth than any search before it. This is the story of how a modern airliner disappeared without a trace, and why, 11 years later, the people who never stopped looking believe they are finally closing in. It began as the most unremarkable kind of flight. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 pushed back from Kuala Lumpur International Airport just after midnight on the 8th of March, 2014, bound for Beijing on a routine 6-hour route that crews had flown thousands of times without incident. On board were 227 passengers and 12 crew, drawn from more than a dozen countries, the largest group being Chinese nationals heading home or returning from business and holidays. In the cockpit sat a veteran captain with tens of thousands of flying hours and a co-pilot still completing his training on the aircraft type. The plane climbed to cruising altitude, trekked northeast across the Malay Peninsula, and settled into the quiet rhythm of an overnight flight. 39 minutes in, as the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the crew radioed back a routine handover acknowledgement. It was an ordinary phrase, spoken without urgency or hesitation. It would turn out to be the last words anyone ever heard from the flight. That arc gave the world its first real target, but a target that size is almost meaningless in human terms. It described a search zone larger than many countries, over water that plunges thousands of meters deep, across a seabed that had never been mapped in any detail. What followed was the most expensive, most technologically ambitious underwater search in aviation history. Ships towed sonar arrays for months across some of the roughest seas on Earth. Autonomous underwater vehicles descended into total darkness to map ridges, canyons, and sediment plains no one had ever charted. Searchers found shipwrecks over a century old, mapped underwater volcanoes, and added more to scientific knowledge of that stretch of ocean floor than had been gathered in decades prior. But of the aircraft itself, they found nothing. Not a fragment. Not an echo. After scouring roughly 120,000 square kilometers of seabed, the original underwater search was suspended without a result, and the ships came home. More than a year after the disappearance, the ocean finally offered something. A large curved piece of aircraft wing washed ashore on a remote island territory on the far side of the Indian Ocean, encrusted with barnacles, and unmistakably identified as a control surface from a Boeing 777. A model with only one aircraft unaccounted for anywhere in the world. Over the following months and years, more fragments turned up scattered across a wide arc of coastline, a section of engine covering, a piece of interior cabin paneling, a segment of wing flap whose damage pattern led some investigators to believe the aircraft struck the water at high speed with no one actively working the controls. These pieces confirmed the plane had gone into the sea, but they could not say where. Drift modeling, tracing ocean currents backward from where each fragment washed up, pointed broadly toward the original search zone, but could not narrow it enough to matter. The main wreckage, and the black boxes that could finally explain what happened in that cockpit, stayed exactly where they had always been, on the bottom of the ocean and found. Long before drones and robots re-entered the picture, scientists had already begun looking for answers in an unlikely place, the barnacles growing on the recovered wing fragments themselves. Barnacles build their shells in daily layers, a little like tree rings, and the chemistry locked inside each layer reflects the temperature of the water the creature was living in at the time. By studying those microscopic growth bands on the wing piece that washed ashore, researchers realized they could, in theory, reconstruct a rough timeline of where that piece of aircraft had drifted, and possibly work backward toward the patch of ocean where it first entered the water. It was a slow, painstaking kind of forensic science, more suited to a laboratory than a search vessel, but it added another thread of evidence pointing broadly back toward the same stretch of the southern Indian Ocean that the satellite data had already identified. In the years since, the case has never fully closed, even after official government-funded search efforts ended. What kept the file open was a mix of persistence and improving technology. A private search by the marine robotics company Ocean Infinity resumed the hunt in the years that followed, working under a no-find, no-fee arrangement with the Malaysian government, meaning the company would only be paid if it actually located the wreckage. Malaysia signed that agreement with Ocean Infinity in March 2025, and authorities identified a new roughly 15,000 square kilometre search zone in the southern Indian Ocean, chosen as the area experts now consider to have the highest probability of containing the wreckage, based on a fresh reanalysis of satellite data, drift patterns, and other overlooked details. The renewed effort deployed a new fleet of underwater robots capable of operating independently at depths of up to 6,000 meters, for up to 100 hours at a stretch. A dramatic leap beyond the towed sonar sleds of the original search. If the wreckage is confirmed, Ocean Infinity stands to be paid roughly $70 million by the Malaysian government. If it fails, the company receives nothing. An arrangement designed to keep the incentives honest on both sides. The search unfolded across more than one phase, with vessels working the seabed for weeks at a time before pausing for resupply or weather. Progress reports released through early 2026 describe autonomous vehicles sweeping thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor along the arc where the aircraft's last satellite signal placed it, using multiple drones simultaneously to cover more ground than any earlier campaign. By mid-January 2026, the latest phase had covered a cumulative area of more than 7,000 square kilometers within the search sector, using up to 3 autonomous underwater vehicles operating largely without interruption until weather forced a pause. As of the most recent official update, that phase had not produced a confirmed discovery. That is the honest state of the search right now, not solved, not abandoned, but narrower and better resourced than it has ever been, with investigators and searchers who describe real confidence that they are looking in the right place, even though the machines have not yet closed their sensors over an answer. It is worth sitting with why that distinction matters. In a story with this much emotional weight, there is always a temptation to round the ambiguity up into certainty, to declare the case cracked because a drone glided over a promising patch of seabed, or because a new coordinate leaked into a headline. That temptation is exactly what has fed years of premature claims and unverified stories about MH370 being found, almost none of which held up. The responsible version of this story is less satisfying and more honest. The search has been reopened with the best tools and the best data anyone has ever brought to it, and it has not yet delivered a confirmed wreck. Even if it eventually does, there is a sobering technical detail that rarely makes the headlines. The cockpit voice recorder aboard MH370, like most aircraft of its era, was only designed to retain the final 2 hours of audio before older recordings are automatically overwritten. If the aircraft flew on for several hours after its last radio contact, as the satellite data suggests it did, then whatever was said or done in the critical early minutes after the turn may already be gone, recorded over by the long silent hours that followed. That means even a successful recovery of the wreckage, and the recorders might tell searchers exactly where the plane went without ever fully explaining why. That is not a cover-up or a conspiracy. It is simply a limitation baked into the recording equipment of the time, and it is one of the reasons this mystery has resisted a clean resolution even as the physical search improves. In the absence of a confirmed answer, competing theories have circulated for over a decade, and it's worth naming them honestly rather than picking a winner none of them have earned. One explanation centers on a catastrophic mechanical failure, such as an onboard fire, or a sudden loss of cabin pressure, that could have incapacitated everyone aboard while the aircraft continued flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. That theory accounts for the long, silent, uncommunicative final hours, but struggles to explain the deliberate turns and precise navigation recorded on military radar in the minutes after the last radio call, since an incapacitated crew is unlikely to have flown with that kind of apparent intention. A second theory holds that someone in the cockpit deliberately diverted the aircraft, a theory that investigators have never been able to prove or fully dismiss, and that has understandably been painful and contested among people who knew those on board. A third theory involves a hijacking or unauthorized takeover by someone aboard, though no group ever claimed responsibility, no demands were made, and no clear motive has ever surfaced. And then there are the fringe theories that conspiracy tends to produce whenever real information is scarce, explanations that ask people to believe evidence was hidden or suppressed, which is a much easier claim to make than it is to support. None of these theories currently has definitive physical evidence behind it, and presenting any of them as settled fact would be misleading. Investigators who spent years combing through the personal lives of the crew, their finances, their relationships, and even a home flight simulator belonging to the captain, never produced anything close to conclusive proof of intent. And those who knew him have consistently pushed back against reading too much into fragments of circumstantial detail. That absence of proof cuts both ways. It means no one can honestly claim the mystery has been solved by any of these explanations, but it also means no one has been able to fully rule any of them out either. The truth is that nobody outside of that cockpit knows exactly what happened, and the only thing that can genuinely resolve that uncertainty is the aircraft itself. What has changed, and what makes this moment different from the many false alarms before it, is the quality of the search now underway. Earlier search phases relied heavily on human analysts reviewing sonar images by eye for hour after exhausting hour, a process that made it entirely possible for a genuine signal to be misread as ordinary rock or seabed clutter somewhere along the way. For the families of the 239 people who boarded that flight, none of this has ever been an abstraction or a puzzle to be solved for entertainment. It has been more than a decade of anniversaries marked without an ending, of memorials held for people whose final resting place is still unknown, of hope raised and lowered again with every reported update. If the current search eventually does succeed, it will not undo any of that. But it may finally give those families something they have been denied since March of 2014, a location. A point on a map they can look toward, instead of an entire ocean they've had to carry in their minds for 11 years. So here is the honest question worth asking, rather than a false answer worth clicking on. If the wreckage is eventually found, but the voice recorder has nothing left to tell us about those first critical minutes, would that actually be an ending? Or would we simply trade one unanswered question, where the plane went, for another that may never be answered at all, why it went there in the first place? Let me know what you think happened in that cockpit, and whether you believe finding the plane could ever truly close a mystery like this one. If this story matters to you, stay with us, because the moment this search produces a real, confirmed update, we'll be the ones bringing it to you straight, without the hype.